Good morning. Thanks for coming. I guess this is a quarterly event to celebrate the latest publication of Issues in Science and Technology, in this case the winter edition, in which we feature one of our authors in conversation with a provocateur or interlocutor, or whatever, however you'd like to be described. So we hope everyone grabbed a copy of Issues, and you can even grab two and give one to your friends. But in this latest issue, besides Chuck Herrick's piece on the endless war on coal, maybe the nation's longest war after Iraq, or before, even including Iraq. On the alleged war on coal, there's articles on Britain's industrial policy, which could end up being a model for us, on infrastructure and climate change, on future or not future of nuclear energy, and so on. All engagingly written, so that hopefully, whatever your particular interests are, you'll find them accessible and valuable. So. One of our articles was Chuck Herrick's timeline on kind of the politics of coal. Chuck is a political scientist by training, something I don't know if you've been trying to run away from that or not.
I don't think I've ever admitted that
So,
publicly.
yeah, okay, sorry. And what are friends for? And was also a principal for many years. Were you a founder of Stratus Consulting?
No.
All right. At Stratus Consulting, a environmental consulting firm, and Chuck specializes in the whole question of how to make science useful for environmental policy making and decision making. And then, in addition to Chuck, we have Unruh, Cohen, who is right now, recently became the chief policy honcho at NRDC, Natural Resources Defense Council, after many years on the Hill, working for Senator Markey, working in the lower house, the house where I hail from, proudly, and so has recently made the big switch from what many people don't know is the most hierarchically flat organization in the world, which is Congress, to a different sort of organization in the nonprofit sector. So the deal is they'll chat for a half hour or so, and then we invite you all to engage them with your questions, ideas, comments, and provocations. And we'll quit after an hour and invite you all to hang around and talk to each other and finish the coffee, and then return to your dreary day jobs. And then I guess if there's anyone from the media here, just nothing for attribution. If you do hear something that you'd like to follow up on, please discuss it with the source beforehand to get permission and so on. So with that said, I'll turn it over to you guys. Chuck.
Do I need the microphone? Yes.
Yeah, they're live streaming it, so I think you.
Is it, I'm on, obviously, okay. Thanks, Dan. Thanks for coming this morning. The piece, Dan introduced it as a depiction of a 100-year war against coal. And since I love to disagree with Dan, I'm going to disagree with that. It wasn't my intention. I wasn't inspired to try to suggest that we're going through an elongated war on coal. My reaction to the rhetoric of the war on coal was actually that I thought it was dubious that there was such a thing as a war on coal. So my inspiration for the timeline was to try to depict that coal, like other energy sources, like other economic sectors, goes through many challenges over time, some environmental, some economic, some market-based, some related to labor and social issues, but all of them just kind of accrue through time. Sometimes they get recognized in the context of policy and regulation, not always. And since the piece was targeted for issues in science and technology, you might notice that almost every event on the timeline involves some contribution of technological development or scientific advancement. I wanted to show that for every single one of them, but in some cases I wasn't able. So what I thought was interesting was that if you explore US history, go back a ways, you find lots of events that provided a challenge or provide a challenging situation to the coal industry or the coal sector. And that was what I think the timeline represents, and not so much a war. I've had it suggested to me that I might be overly sensitive to the use of the word war, that it might just be a semantic issue, and for that reason, just not all that interesting. And I really disagree with that. I think reasoned discourse in this country matters, and I think words have meanings, and I think we ought to respect the meanings of words. And so I want to riff for a minute or two on the choice of a war metaphor to describe this evolving policy situation, policy and social situation with coal. The war metaphor. Several things are problematic for me with respect to the use of a war metaphor. I mean, first it tends to take the conversation out of the rational and put it into the emotional, which is fine if you want to draw attention to something. Everybody in Washington understands that. But in this case, it would be nice, I think, in some cases, to have a reasoned dialogue over whether, say, research dollars for carbon capture and storage are as good as or better than research dollars for something like hydrogen fuel cells, without having to kind of fight your way through an argument that you're being warlike with respect to one side or the other. Interesting, difficult policy debate sometimes doesn't need the emotion that the war metaphor attaches to it. Second reason not to use something like a war metaphor. The war metaphor takes us out of the realm of policy as normal and puts us into a different arena. Most policy isn't made or implemented or evaluated from the perspective of a war. So in this case, again, when we discuss the appropriate energy portfolio for the United States moving forward, it seems distracting to couch it in terms of a war situation rather than just an evolving policy situation in which we need to be reasoned and rigorous in terms of comparative costs and benefits. And then finally, in some of the quotes in the article, you may have noticed that the EPA administrator stood up and announced that this war was over. And that's another aspect of the policy deliberation process that just seems a little off kilter in this case. It seems a bit cynical to stand up in front of people whose lives may actually have been impacted by this ongoing challenge with respect to coal, and now to suggest that somehow that's like the end of World War II on the deck of a battleship, just gets signed away and normality will return in the next couple of years. So it sets the stage for unreasonable policy expectations, I think, or I try to argue with the little essay. And then lastly, I'd just like to say a word about where this came from. I teach a class here at NYU every fall called History of American Environmental Policy. And it's a wonderful class, and it's a cool class because the way we address it is we focus on policy issues in America that impact the environment for better or for worse, intentionally or unintentionally, that originate at any level of government. So we explore environmental policies and it's a survey course, so we literally go back to colonial times. So we explore mercantilism and colonialism as environmental policies. We explore the subsidization of the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States as an environmental policy. We spend about half of one session looking at the Vietnam War as an environmental policy. So the course this past fall was fun for me because this war metaphor talk was slinging and bouncing around at the same time as we in the class were going across this broad swath of history and talking about policies that for one reason or another involved coal and had an impact on the environment. So that's kind of my long introduction about why this is here and why I'm here.
All right, I've got to jump up and advance the slide because I have a picture to share with you all as well. So let me see if I can do that. Yeah, here we go. So betraying my science roots, I have a graph, but have tried to put some additional things on there. Well, one, I want to know how to audit Chuck's class. That sounds like a fascinating thing to do. But his warning on the use of war as a metaphor notwithstanding, I might argue that EPA regulations, and especially when it comes to the Clean Air Act, is not a war on a certain fuel, but actually a war for public health. And that you can go back to, it was actually the second law that President Lyndon Johnson signed into law in December of 1963, was the original Clean Air Act, or the original law that had that title. And it was set as a public health law. The EPA didn't exist yet. This Office of Air Pollution that the law created was set in Health and Human Services. It didn't have a lot of teeth, and so that's why most people mark the first Clean Air Act as 1970, when the EPA is then in existence and gets some real enforcement power. But the alleged war on coal is really just that, an allegation, and not really actuality, unless you're talking about a market share war, which is part of why I wanted to put this slide up here. So we start in 2001 over in one corner and go to 2016, and this is just EIA's U.S. production of coal, and for those energy wonks in the room, it's dry natural gas that's up there, so the sort of cleaned up natural gas that goes into pipelines that can come into your home or into electric power plants. And so I put some markers on here, some of which are also on the timeline you saw previously. But you can see here when we have Massachusetts versus EPA decision from the Supreme Court in April 2007, coal is approaching its actual, what became its maximum production level, or and probably for history, since what happens at the other end of the slide. And you can see a low in 2005 of natural gas production as more and more shale plays, first in Texas and Louisiana, start adding natural gas to the U.S. reservoirs, and that just starts going up. So then, by having, I was in Congress in that 2007 time frame, 2008, when Nancy Pelosi became Speaker, she created something called the Select Committee on Energy Independence and Global Warming that Mr. Markey was the chair of, and that I was the Deputy Staff Director and Chief Scientist for. And we spent a lot of 2007 and 2008 studying energy and global warming issues. and educating both Congress and the public. And one of the things, you're here from DC, many of you know that congressional hearings are often theater and are more opinion pieces than necessarily just an open fora for discussing issues. But we actually must have been in early 2008, having had a number of people involved with shale natural gas coming to talk to us, did have a hearing that was fairly unique in my experience of just pretty wide open, let's learn about natural gas production and use that we had in the Select Committee. And I would say, you know, even then, as we were taking what we learned in the Select Committee in the 2008 timeline to write some kind of message legislation for Mr. Markey, that much of it got incorporated into what was Waxman-Markey. You know, we were still the bounty of natural gas, or the resource of natural gas that shale plays would turn out to have in the U.S. was still really pretty hard to imagine. And you can see, you know, part of that is because we just hadn't seen the production numbers going up yet to the extent that we're now at here in 2016. So the other thing about Waxman-Markey that many of you may not know is we had a huge amount of money that would go to the coal industry, both to support the development of carbon capture and sequestration, to encourage the use of that technology, and then additionally funding for worker transition and community help. And many of you know, what could have been our allies in the environmental world actually were pretty upset with us for including so much help for coal. But our judgment, both on the policy and the politics, was that we needed to try and find some answers for continuing to use coal in a carbon-constrained economy. The irony to the, you know, why a climate bill didn't get to President Obama's desk, which is probably a whole other conversation, but part of it was determined effort by coal industry players, coal producers in particular. And, you know, looking back on this data, they had their highest production level in 2008. And they, you know, one could argue that a lot of support from a cap and trade program, fund generation that would be happening now would actually be helping the coal industry, and I would argue in particular helping coal workers and their communities. But you can't rewrite history. So we all know Waxman-Markey or a climate bill did not come to fruition, and instead the Obama administration looked at administrative actions, both to fulfill public health goals and, frankly, a congressional directive from the 1990 Clean Air Act, which is what brings us to the mercury rule that gets finalized in 2012. It still has some court issues that we could talk about if other people in the audience or Chuck want to talk about that later. But you can see that comes into effect in 2012. The first compliance period is 2015, so it's sort of between 2012 and 2015 when coal plants are having to work to either put on mercury controls or do other things. And you know, the graph is a little it shows kind of an inflection point there. That's not real. It's just how the two lines look together on two different axes. But you can see in 2011, another kind of sharp drop off in coal production happening. That's happening prior to the Mercury rule coming into effect. Now, at that point, it's looking pretty likely that one will come. So, you could argue companies were already reacting to that inevitability, which does put some constraints on coal usage. But largely, it's market forces that are driving these production numbers. And then you can see, the Clean Power Plan was finalized by the Obama administration in August of 2015, well, that was when the party at the White House was. I guess it probably wasn't in the Federal Register till a couple months after that. But you can see, already there's a big drop off in coal. There's a big increase in natural gas production. And because my graphing abilities are not nearly what they were when I was in graduate school, what I don't have on here, but what almost assuredly all of you in the audience know, is a rapid increase in capacity in solar and wind in particular over similar time frames. And definitely don't quote me on this, but my memory will be close to correct that in 2005, we added on the order of 79 megawatts of solar PV capacity in all of the United States. And then a decade later, in 2015, we added on the order of 7,000 megawatts of solar PV, and then in subsequent years have added even bigger numbers than that. So that's, in the grand scheme of things, solar and wind, I guess it looks like wind is about to pass hydro, could pass hydroelectric generation this year for the biggest source of renewable energy. Obviously, a much smaller component in the larger generation scheme at the moment, but for most of the last 5 years, it's been natural gas and wind and solar that have really been adding the most capacity to electric generation in the U.S. And we've continued many of our energy efficiency trends. So, we've seen carbon pollution fall off, especially in the electric sector, fairly dramatically to get the type of reductions that we need to keep the U.S. and the world marginally safe from the impacts of climate change. So the main story in the issue on infrastructure resilience to extreme weather. For some of the challenges we face, we'll need a bigger drop off. But at the moment, the market, state policies, federal tax policies, business preferences for renewables, consumer preferences are driving us in a pretty good direction when it comes to electric emissions from the electricity sector, which means actually that transportation is increasingly the challenge for us when we're looking at how to reduce U.S. emissions over the long term. So I think that's probably all I was going to say to start. So we should go from here. I don't know if
Chuck, you want
you.
to react or should we turn it over to?
Well, yeah, I've got a question for you. How about that? So I think you were trying to get at it. I mean, a lot of those laws, whether it's iterations of the Clean Air Act, or PURPA have really driven innovation in technology, but also changes in the electric marketplace. So I don't know if you want to say a little bit about that push from policy changes.
Yeah, I think. Am I still? Yeah, I'm audible. I think that is an interesting issue, and I always get confused or don't feel confident when I try to consider whether a policy is the cause of innovation or whether the policy is the beneficiary of prior innovation. It tends to be just kind of a case-by-case study, really. But the examples on the chart do suggest that innovation is associated with, obviously, the evolution of policy. I wanted to elaborate a little bit in terms of, you had mentioned you were sticking with the war metaphor, and it's a war for public health, I think, is how you characterized it. Since Dan already outed me as a political scientist, I do want to continue to push back against kind of throwing around the war metaphor. There's a lot of policy activity, with respect to public health and its nexus with fossil fuels, especially coal. I think the way to talk about that is to talk about a policy, an evolving policy regime over time, and whether it favors one particular technology or one particular sector or not. There's a lot of things that the timeline could have shown if Dan would have given me the entire issue, that weren't shown. It could have mentioned the Clean Water Act and permitting processes for coal mining and how it constrained those type of activities. It could have mentioned some of the surface mining laws that came into effect, I think, under Carter, if I remember right. So you can look at a sector like the coal sector and point to a lot of policy activity that may favor the sector or may constrain the sector, and still not just fall into the metaphor of somebody has declared war on it, and there's a concerted activity that's being undertaken with that in mind. I am reminded that I'm not sure you mentioned, I don't think you mentioned the Sierra Club, the big Sierra Club Beyond Coal initiative funded by Mike Bloomberg, and I think they actually do use the war metaphor as kind of a rallying cry for that effort, and it's an interesting effort because it did target activities at the state and local level, at the public utility level, at the plant-by-plant permitting level. So you kind of closed with the observation that there's a lot happening not only at the federal sector, but at the state level, I think even at the municipal level in some cases, at the advocacy level, at the market level. So no argument that there's a lot going on that's having a real material effect on taking us away from a coal-based economy, I think, is the way we, but that's an observation that came to mind.
Okay, are there questions? I've certainly got some, but, yep, please.
Yeah, Jacob Scher. On the way here, I happened to notice a article about a new report coming out of Coal India, which apparently is the largest coal-producing entity on the planet, in which they look forward to 2030 and they say our business model has changed, and we're going to have to deal with the onset of reality of renewables, and in a situation where the market for coal is going to be depressed. And I'm curious, do we see any of that kind of more enlightened forward thinking in our own coal industry in the United States? And then my second question would be, and maybe Chuck, given the fact that you are a bit of an environmental historian, do we have any good examples of where we've seen, technological and political change that has resulted in a diminution of an industry, and we've done a good job in actually helping workers transition to new types of jobs? Or is this, because I feel in some ways, I'd never thought of the Waxman-Markey bill as sort of a big bailout for the coal industry. And in some ways, we made that industry and the people working in that industry may have been better off if that bill had actually passed. And there had been a real concerted effort to kind of cushion the transformation.
The transformation of an industry working well. Anna might, there are efforts, I'm not going to say it's working well. The transformation of an industry, there's thoughtfulness behind some of the transformation in the fisheries sector, I would argue. We realize that current rates of extraction of fishery stocks are unsustainable, and so there are laws in place, the Magnuson-Stevens Act, that focus not only on turning around or reversing the environmental or the resource impact, but doing it in a way that sustains that sustains fisheries as an industry. And it's written in a way that shows sensitivity to fishing communities. It's written in a way that is forward-looking with respect to the replacement of current practices and current technologies with sustainable practices and sustainable technologies. There are examples of it being implemented by particular councils or by particular states in a way that's forward-looking. But I think the jury is just way, way, way out still if we go ahead 50 years and look back from that vantage point as to whether it did a good job of successfully transitioning an industry out of environmentally unsustainable practices and into something that's more sustainable. That's what comes to mind for me. Otherwise, I don't have...
And on your first question about coal-producing companies, I have to say, of the companies who actually dig it out of the ground, in the U.S., I haven't seen too much realization or acceptance of what their fate is likely to be. I do think they're major consumers, so the large electric utilities that burn coal, even back in Waxman-Markey era, saw the writing on the wall. The Edison Electric Institute, which is the trade industry or association for the large investor-owned utilities, worked closely in crafting the bill and endorsed it. And I think as the Clean Power Plan came on, they sort of acknowledged that that's the way they were moving already. And have continued even as the Trump administration and Administrator Pruitt have worked to undo the Clean Power Plan. It hasn't, as far as I can tell, changed their plans too much just because of what the market and their consumers are telling them what they want. There was it last week? Maybe it was the week before last. EEI, the Edison Electric Institute and NRDC had a joint statement on kind of the future of electric utilities and in a carbon-constrained world that is the fourth of those type of statements over the last handful of years. So we still find that despite potentially a more favorable administration to them, they still are acting this way. Part of it is because of Massachusetts versus EPA Supreme Court decision and the Clean Air Act authority that a new administration could choose to use, as well as depending on how congressional numbers change, future energy and or climate bills that would affect their emissions of carbon dioxide. So,
other questions? Yep.
Yes, this is directed to Chuck, but also to you. I wonder, and I hope your answer to this is no, or even hell no. In considering the longitudinal history of coal and maybe more globally the entire energy mix that we always talk about, have you ever used the framework that we use in political science? By the way, I'm also a recovering political scientist. I went through a 9-point program of regimes. The way that they do, and maybe they don't do this anymore, in international relations. Some people who refer to regimes as the comity, C-O-M-I-T-Y, of eras. You can sort of periodize putative eras based upon the techno-political protective, I never use the word regulatory, cultural, global strategic vectors, creating or putatively creating a particular period in the history of coal or something like that. Have you ever considered using that in your course or in your consideration of the history and how it unfolds? And again, regimes are usually retrospectively imputed or imparted after you've had some sort of a major either technological innovation or policy change as a vector.
No.
Don't. No, because I say that only because regimes, especially when they use it in international relations, is very, very nebulous because it means all of the factors. But you know, it might actually work. And I actually read a book that used the R word. I always call it public protection and not regulation. Many years ago, where they did regulatory regimes. I don't use that word. Public protection. That's why we have to call it the war for public health, or the campaign for public health.
I'm actually fascinated by the construct of regime, and I haven't used it in the class, but I'm actually thinking about it. So I think I'm actually.
So maybe it's maybe.
It's maybe. I'm current. Okay, to just deflect off the reason we're here. I'm actually working on something right now where I'm trying to discern whether the United States has a policy regime for invasive species. And what we have is something like 42 laws that are in place, and I could go on for a long, long time about this, but I think using a construct like policy regime as a way to make sense of all that's going on in the policy world is formalizing, rigorous, and potentially helpful is how I look at it. To come back to what we're here to look at today, we were talking about, a lot of the talk about Obama conducting a war on coal comes from the fact that the Obama administration came forward with the Clean Power Plan. At the same time as the Obama administration was coming forward with the Clean Power Plan, they were being criticized on other fronts. The Obama Bureau of Land Management was being criticized on other fronts because they were making it too easy to extract coal from the Powder River Basin, which was then being exported. So there was this argument that the Obama administration was kind of talking out of both sides of its mouth. On the one hand, regulating carbon emissions. On the other hand, promoting their export to states and nations that might not be so careful with its combustion. And that kind of thing would have a spotlight on it if you looked at it through a regime construct, I think. And so I haven't been carefully thinking about it that way, but that's a reaction to your comment that comes to mind.
You couldn't come up with a name for the regime because it's so dichotomous.
Yeah, what would you call it? Yeah, it's this stuff that's happening in the policy world that pertains to coal more or less in some period of time that we arbitrarily define, right?
Just to add on to, I mean, whoops, here we go. The Mercury rule, opponents of it tried to use the war on coal metaphor there as well, but you just had a much closer connection to public health and limiting really terrible toxic air pollutants from going into the air, that it sort of failed. Whereas with climate change, which also has serious public health implications, it's sort of second and third order effects, so you don't have as close a tie. And I think their opponents of that policy were able to use the war metaphor sort of more successfully. And I should add, my role at NRDC is actually sort of chief political hack. So really, I'm always looking how do I flip the script. So if they're using war on coal, then I want to say actually it's a war for public health. But campaign, use the word campaign. That's probably a better one. Yeah.
Following up on use of words. Oh, I'm Jim Sang, and I'm a retired physicist, and so I'm not that used to narratives, although actually I am. But insofar as we like to do history in terms of narratives, isn't it the case that almost any historic narrative can be cast in terms of a war? I mean, the disappearance of horses from urban American life could be viewed as a war, but there's also a lot of other things going on. So isn't there a question of whether your use of the war passes some kind of laugh test or not?
I guess you could, sure, you could frame it that way, and we could have a lot of fun with the various wars in history. In terms of the war on coal, it's perhaps trivial, but interesting to me that during the Industrial Revolution, when coal combustion started to become more and more common, it was displacing human craft type industry, especially in the textile industry as an example, and the little term Luddite that we like to tease each other about when we're not technologically savvy actually comes about from textile workers who were opposed to the mechanization of the textile industry. So it could have been the first shot in the war for coal that later evolved into a war against coal. But I think you're right. You could construct a narrative. My timeline, we could argue about whether it should have gone back 250 years or whether 100 years was too long, and it would be more serious if it only went back 25 years. We could argue that every vignette on it was inappropriate, and that there was an alternate vignette that should have gone on it. So sure, I agree. It's a matter
In fact, today's event could be seen as the beginning of Herrick's war on the use of the term war on things.
Yeah, and I hope it is.
Hi, I'm Dara Kotobala. I'm a grad student at ASU here in DC. In terms of to follow on to the narrative conversation, it seems to me that it could be characterized as learning curves or as emerging innovation in response of corporate entities in response to global forces of public protection, and that companies will have varying levels of acumen in regard, and there'll be sort of leaders and laggards, early adopters, in terms of getting their act together strategically. So as we see fossil divestment at a large scale internationally, petroleum companies looking at what else can they invest in, creating pools of capital. And from in Arizona, where I'm from, utilities and out of 5 owners of a coal plant, a Navajo generating station, kind of backing out of it. Where do you see the leadership in the U.S. and what kinds of things do you see them doing? And does the emergence of something like storage as something FERC is addressing in utility policy play into future strategies?
Well, I think
You were going to be the forward-looking person.
okay. I'll be the forward-looking part. Although I will, you already sort of talked a little bit about whether innovation drives policy or policy drives innovation. My sort of personal, mostly anecdotal experience is it's a little bit of both. You really can't. Part of our challenge in trying to move Waxman-Markey was to help the country understand we did have these other sources of electricity, and you weren't going to sit in the dark if we were constraining the use of fossil fuels potentially, or at least changing how they were burned. Going on, what are we? We're in 2018, right? So going on 9 years later, that story is very different because people can sign up for PV panels on their roof at Home Depot. People out west, in particular, can see farmland with wind turbines, and farmers getting royalties from that corner of their farm that's got a turbine on it, while they continue to farm most of the rest of the land. So it's much more tangible, I think, now for people to understand making that transition. I think storage is incredibly crucial for the next step, because people know the wind doesn't blow every day, the sun obviously sets each night, and thankfully comes up every morning. But you have
So
to.
far.
So far. So you have to help them understand how that could actually meet a large part of our needs. And I think that's really a lot of the last decade's untold story. There's the coupling of natural gas with renewables and what that means going forward. And now with storage coming on, I think I'm correct in a bid for, I think, storage and wind out in Colorado came in at like just an incredibly low price point recently. And I think we're looking back, probably even, we won't have to go too far in the future to look back and understand really how dynamic this period was for the electric utilities. But we really we're at a point where, the original model of a power plant with lines going out to who needs it is competing with a much more dynamic model of distributed sources, storage, grid connected, very decentralized view of the electricity sector. And there's tensions there. And I think it's, that's where the policy intervention and R&D support is needed now to help move the electricity sector in particular to a more coherent. I mean, there's competition now. I mean, just look at the Trump administration's request to FERC, which they denied, to keep coal plants and nuclear plants kind of running and subsidize their running for reliability issues. And I think there's a big question mark of, can large centralized generation facilities, whether they're coal or nuclear, survive, or how are they integrated into a much more dynamic electricity system with distributed resources, storage, offshore wind coming on as well.
Hi, I'm Ben Mandler at the American Geosciences Institute. If you took your graph and extended it to today, given that the coal production, the precipitous decline in coal production has steadied in the last year and a half, but seems, if not destined to, but likely to continue to decrease into the future. Is there a concern that is creating a false sense of security in the coal industry in very large coal-producing states like Wyoming and West Virginia and Kentucky? And what is the role, would you say, or do you know much about current activities going on at the federal and state level in policy to address the need for retraining and revitalization of areas that will continue to have decreased coal production into the future, despite the current hiatus in that decrease?
Well, on the retraining front, I mean, the Obama administration had a proposal. There's a couple of pieces of legislation that have been out there that just really haven't ever gotten through Congress and the funding appropriated that they would need to support those communities. You know, the Trump administration seems to think just getting rid of the, you know, what they allege are regulatory barriers to coal use will revitalize the industry. But although, yes, 2017, there's a little bit of a uptick there. But despite that, I think, you know, it will either flatten or continue to decrease. You know, a lot of the Western coal producers were really looking to Asia for export markets. There's a lot of Eastern coal production that is actually exported to Europe at the moment. So they're looking at their export markets, which also seem to be drying up. I think, you know, time will tell what those are, but I don't think they're going to be the salvation to coal production in the U.S. that, you know, companies might have tried to sell. We, NRDC, did some focus group works in coal communities to better understand how they see renewables largely. And it, you know, is different types of groups of people, but mostly in the sort of working class grouping, I would say. And almost all of them understood that our electricity sector was changing, renewables were coming on, and they were interested in there. What they actually reacted to negatively, and you know, it's understandable. Coal was incredibly important to the development of this country. It fueled our ability to fight and succeed in World War II. It helped us, you know, both in our post-World War II boom at home and to support countries' economic development abroad. So, I mean, I cannot sit here and tell you that coal has always been bad for America. It's just that we now realize there is this waste product from it that threatens the world for my 9-year-old when she's my age. And, I mean, threatens us now. If, you know, pick fire or hurricane, you know, for your extreme weather event this year in America. So they were reacting very negatively to this idea, their perception that especially environmental advocates and advocates for more renewables dismiss coal and say what they do, what their, you know, fathers did and grandfathers did, to sort of dismiss that contribution to America. And so that's really, you know, a good thing to incorporate, to understand that those communities have sensitivities, but they understand what the future is. They just don't want their contribution to America to be dismissed by advocates of moving more rapidly to that cleaner energy future.
The other thing is we're speaking of coal as if it's this single monolithic unified thing, and historically there's been a lot of conflict within coal between, say, workers and owners. One of the events that I really wanted to put on the timeline was the 1914 Colorado Coal Field Wars. They were actually called that. And it involved the something called the Ludlow Massacre, where the Colorado National Guard and the Pinkertons, hired by, it was John Rockefeller's coal company, put down a strike of Colorado coal workers. And they were striking over things like excessively long working hours, low wages, So within coal, there's, I mean, obviously not news to anyone in the room probably, but tensions within coal and between the industry and those employed by the industry. The Colorado Coalfield Wars and the Ludlow Massacre were events that helped to eventuate some of the child labor laws that we have in the United States. So it kind of does fall into this discussion, and it involves the question of taking care of the people within the industry.
And you have a modern example now with the uptick in black lung in West Virginia that's just recently been reported on. And we had a coal miners' pension fight happening in Congress that took really, frankly, much longer to resolve than it should have, given the bipartisan support for coal miners.
They kindly give me another bite at the apple. I wanted to, this has been a great conversation about the use of language in describing this debate, and I wanted to get a bit of reaction from you from a tweet earlier this month from Ed Markey, who said, Trump says there's a war on coal. iPhones weren't a war on rotary phones, they were a revolution. The horseless carriage wasn't a war on horses, it was a revolution. The icebox wasn't a war on salted meats, it was a revolution. Clean energy isn't a war on coal, it's a revolution. And I'm wondering, to what extent does the metaphor of revolution or transformation, is that the way we should be talking about what's going on in the world today, that we really are at a point in which we're seeing, because of technological and economic and policy changes, very rapid transformations, which are absolutely essential if we're really going to deal with the challenge of global warming. And I'm just be curious for your reaction in that framing.
I'm completely stuck back on the one about how the war against rotary phones was a revolution, because it was. I guess since I'm being adamant that the use of one word is inappropriate, I should be adamant in terms of having an alternative for its use. I'm not sure I do, though. Transformational initiatives seems like it's something that makes sense in that context. And we have histories of transformations in industries. We have people who think they can advise us on how to pull them off and make transformations within industries, particular industries, happen. So I guess my not terribly thoughtful response would be that something like transformation seems like an appropriate term.
Well, I'm going to get the last question then. So, and then we'll wrap up. And this isn't quite fully formed in my head yet, but it's about the politics of not just climate, but in environmental regulation vis-a-vis technological change, because your story of the marketplace and the rise of natural gas and fracking and so on, and its effect on coal, made me think about spotted owl and the decline of logging communities, which had a strong technological signal, as does of course the fishing industry. Made me think about CFC regulation, which was which became as successful as it was because the chemical industry developed alternatives. And it made me wonder if there has been if environmental politics has continually made the mistake of not taking innovation and technology seriously enough in its narratives, which have tended to focus on things like the polluter must pay. There's been strong moral undertones to almost all climate debate. My friend Andrew Light at a recent symposium, a philosopher at a recent, who you must know well, at a recent symposium said, if climate change isn't a moral issue, what is? But it seems like those sorts of statements don't necessarily serve environmental politics well when on the receiving end there's people losing their jobs because of what you could describe as technological creative destruction, economic creative destruction. So does this suggest that the environmental movement ought to think about different narratives around innovation, progress, change, that move away from the kind of kind of moralistic, who's good and who's bad way of looking at things, more towards and I guess this is really, in a way, what your story gets at, Chuck, more towards societies change, innovation changes, markets influence things, regulations have a role to play, but it's not just about, who's doing the bad work of dumping crap into the environment, and more about how do we continue to make a better world, and technology and the market is a part of that.
So I'll put my environmental historian hat on here, which is totally an amateur one. But I mean, your question goes back to the very beginning of Unruh versus Pinchot on, do we protect areas, or can we, manage them sustainably to extract some value from them? And I think it's a tension that goes throughout every issue. I think, the environmental community needs to be cognizant of the economic arguments and impacts that they have. I mean, now I'll put my amateur philosopher hat on. We have in English the phrase, "a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush." And as I understand it, basically every culture has some phrase like that, because it's just human nature to be more comfortable with what is known than what you have to depend on for the future. And that was certainly our challenge. I mean, the Select Committee on Energy Independence and Global Warming existed for 4 years, and a large part of our work was finding those stories of where energy transformation was happening in a way that benefited the climate, but also, was creating jobs, was mitigating the economic dislocation, and try and bring those forward, both to just educate, but also to inform policy. And that, is still an important part of the conversation of moving, probably many of you are familiar with Yale and George Mason polling and the segmentation of sort of the publics on global warming. And there's a segment that they label as alarm, which are the most concerned about it, and it's a number one priority for them. And then there's a segment at the end that absolutely, I'm not sure they call them deniers, but it's basically the it's not real group. And then in the middle is a bunch of others who range from sort of concerned to not really paying attention. And if we ever, advocates for climate policy to have national legislation, advocates for any social change have to be able to move that, what I call the mushy middle, to an area of support. And a lot of that will be because people are saying, well, how is that going to affect my gas prices? How is it going to affect my electric bill? And so as some of these newer technologies, low carbon technologies, become more mainstream, back to our question of what drives, does innovation drive policy? Does policy drive innovation? As that becomes more mainstream and people are more comfortable with it, it becomes easier to advance them in support of additional policies. But I think it's a tension that's been there since the beginning of the environmental movement, and one that we will probably always be grappling with.
Last word, Chuck?
I don't have an answer to that question, but just the nexus of technologies and environmental issues is so interesting, and in my class we talk about that theme a lot. We go back, I mentioned that the course begins in colonial times, so a technology that was important in colonial times with respect to the environment was the fence. Indigenous Americans didn't employ them. Colonists came over and did employ them, and it had massive land use implications. So there's a whole emotional history in terms of advocacy and policy and social pressures with respect to the fence. And you can go through and find just lots and lots of equally, kind of trivial but interesting little examples of technologies that become super important with respect to the welfare of people and the welfare of the environment. So that's my reaction to your question.
Thanks. A great final word. So, Ann and Chuck, thank you very much for an incredibly interesting conversation. Thank you all for catalyzing it. Thanks to NYU for hosting this. We'll be back in 3 months with another similar event to launch what, it's always an adventure, but I'm going to assume that we're going to get another issue out in June, though the month before it always seems like it's not possible. But again, thanks again for coming. Hope to see you. And yes, a round of applause, please, for our great panel.